We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cobequid Health Centre doesn't have any inpatient beds. It's not supposed to stay open all night, Mr. Speaker, but over the last month, the Cobequid Health Centre has had to stay open 11 times. It stayed open all night because there was nowhere else to put the patients. Imagine the stress on the healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker, when healthcare professionals are trying to scramble to find places to house patients overnight. It's not a good thing. I'd like to ask the Premier, when healthcare workers are scrambling to find places to house patients, is that enough to acknowledge that the system is in crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly why we continue to make the major capital investments we're making, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the redevelopment of the healthcare delivery in our capital region, the redevelopment of delivery of healthcare in Quebec, Mr. Speaker, and around CBRM. Those are all positive investments to deal with the very issues the Honourable member is talking about. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, successive governments ignored the real challenge when it comes to healthcare infrastructure, and these investments, quite frankly, should have been made back in the mid-2000s when the Conservatives actually had an opportunity to make those investments. We've taken it straight on. We're making those investments, and we're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers. And I want to say thank you to the people at Cobequid, Mr. Speaker, who are part of ensuring that people access primary health care in the region. When we require support, they're there to step up, as they always are, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what the Premier fails to recognize is that this is a successive government, Mr. Speaker, and they haven't taken any real action. Yesterday, Dartmouth General had 60 patients waiting in the emergency room, and staff had to go and ask people to go home and come back later. Yesterday, there were 14 stretchers tied up for emergency offload at the QE2. Yesterday, a critically ill patient on the Eastern Shore needed to be transferred to the QE2, but there couldn't be a doctor to requisition the transfer. These are all things that happened yesterday, and all of these things lead to the need for the Cobequid Health Centre to spring into action and do more than it's currently set out to do. Premier talks about his capital investment. I wonder if the Premier can tell us, is there a plan to give the Cobequid Health Centre the capital improvements that it needs to meet the stresses it's faced under?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, it is certainly part of looking at how we look at the capital region when it comes to delivering health care, Mr. Speaker. There's been a number of times people have suggested in this House that it should be open 24/7, Mr. Speaker. The people who run the organization have suggested that's not appropriate. We're continuing, though, in a conversation whether that has changed, Mr. Speaker, but any time we can make investments in infrastructure, we'll continue to do so. It's why we've taken on some of the challenges that people have avoided for decades, quite frankly, in this province, Mr. Speaker. We've gone in to make sure that we make the appropriate investments in the healthcare infrastructure that meets the needs of our families today. The honourable member raises concerns. That's why we continue, day after day, try to work with our partners to provide the quality care that Nova Scotians are looking for.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Cobequid Health Centre is able to spring into action and help with some of the patients. But people are worried that there's no real plan. What will happen when Northside is closed and New Waterford's closed and they can't just spring into action? People are waiting to see a real plan from the government. I've asked the Premier if he'd take responsibility for the state of healthcare in the province, and he wouldn't. We've asked the minister if we're in a crisis. He won't acknowledge that we're in a crisis, but yet we have paramedics struck with stretchers at the hospitals. We have code censuses, no ambulances, no ambulance availabilities in many places, many parts of this province. I'd like to ask the Premier, if he doesn't consider this a healthcare crisis, can the Premier please define for us what he would consider a healthcare crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, our government actually has taken on this issue, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're going to increase the emergency department at the Cape Breton Regional by, Mr. Speaker, almost 50%, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're seeing an increase in the emergency department in Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable member standing up defending the status quo, which has failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Government has to, Mr. Speaker, not avoid problems, Mr. Speaker. We have to take them on, Mr. Speaker, to solve them on behalf of hard-working Nova Scotians. The Honourable member, Mr. Speaker, wants to live in the past. Mr. Speaker, that infrastructure doesn't meet the needs of the next 60 years. That's why we're making the kind of investments in the Capital Region, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and it's why we're going to continue to work with communities across this province to provide them with the primary care portal, Mr. Speaker, that reflects today's reality, not the one the honourable member stuck in.
The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Every week, frontline healthcare workers are proposing solutions to the healthcare crisis, and just as often these solutions are being overruled or overlooked. At Buchanan Memorial Hospital in Neils Harbor, Dr. Bernard Buffett has explained recently how it's important to have a lab technologist position there from the point of view of the retention and the recruitment of physicians. But the NSHA is eliminating that position. Dr. Buffett has worked at that hospital for 34 years. His mother was a nurse there. His father helped build it. He himself was born there. Doesn't the Premier suppose that Dr. Buffett might know a little something about healthcare in Neils Harbor that the NSHA doesn't?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question, Mr. Speaker. I certainly want to thank the physician for his tremendous work that he's been doing, Mr. Speaker, in supporting that community. Obviously, it sounds like a family that has committed themselves to delivering health care. I think what the honourable member is talking about is the point, the point of testing. Mr. Speaker, point of care testing when it comes to blood work. Mr. Speaker, this change that is taking place right now actually started under the NDP when they were in power, Mr. Speaker. It started in ridings outside of Capital Region, Mr. Speaker. What's happening is continued implementation of their policy. So have they changed their mind at this point? I'm just not curious.
The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Unscheduled emergency room closures have more than doubled in the last year, and the Nova Scotia Nurses Union has made the suggestion to have nurse practitioners staff emergency rooms as a solution to the problem. Nurse practitioners, they've said, could work alongside of advanced care paramedics under the supervision of doctors to provide the emergency care that's needed. Mr. Speaker, can the Premier offer a single solid reason why his government is not moving immediately to adopt this sensible suggestion?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. He's hitting the very nub of the issue, Mr. Speaker. All healthcare providers, we need to allow them to practice the full scope, Mr. Speaker, of the training that they've received. The suggestion that's been brought forward, I'm sure will be part of what the Department of Health looks at, and how can we best make sure that all of our healthcare providers are working to the maximum scope of their training to ensure that Nova Scotians get access to the primary care in their communities.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
In January, the expert panel on long-term care reported on the difficulties that are posed by the shortage of continuing care assistance. And the CCAs themselves, through their union, have suggested that an approach to this problem would be for the government to establish a granting program for those going into the CCA field where tuition's around $7,000. Now, these are the people, Mr. Speaker, who are talking all the time to people who might be reasonably expected to consider going into this line of work. I want to ask the Premier, why doesn't the government simply follow their advice?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward to continue to implement the recommendations, Mr. Speaker, of that committee.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my office obviously has been hearing complaints for well over a year now about issues at the Cobequid Healthcare Emergency Department. We've heard stories about patients, doctors, nurses all having to wait for long hours after midnight because patients are either needing to be transported or because of lack of bed at QE2. We recently received a call this weekend from Cynthia Conrad, who has given her name to be mentioned here in the House, who had to wait at Cobequid for over 48 hours at Cobequid before being transferred to QE2, where she's at the emergency right now as I speak. According to CBC, she's obviously not alone on this. My question is, keeping in mind that Cobequid Healthcare is an emergency department and healthcare center, it's not a hospital, it has very limited food services. My question is, I'd like to know how patients are being fed there. Are we ordering pizza? Are we getting Uber Eats? How are we feeding them?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question. What I can assure the member in terms of the decisions being made by the Nova Scotia Health Authority to maintain patients at the Cobequid Centre, the fact is that in their clinical opinion, given the circumstances, maintaining the healthcare professionals with the patients at that time, that is the best location given the circumstances they were presented with to ensure that their healthcare needs were looked after. And Mr. Speaker, as soon as the opportunity presents itself to move over to the HI or other facility, Mr. Speaker, they complete that task.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that doesn't actually answer the question that I asked. Cobequid is a emergency department. It doesn't have the facilities there required to keep patients more than 12 hours at 12 p.m. at night or 12 a.m. at night. I've asked this, raised this before. I'm serious. I want to know how they're feeding the patients that are there for 3 days. Are they vending machines? What are they doing? How are they feeding them?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member noted, the notion of opening or maintaining Cobequid 24/7 facility and designing the site for that type of care is something that he has previously asked. As noted in my response then, again, the questions get raised. The decision has not been to do that at this point, but in terms of recommendations coming through to government. But, Mr. Speaker, obviously we're seeing a situation, particularly through February, where the use of that facility after the scheduled hours has extended. So if we have to relook at that, we will do so.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. It was reported last night that patients are being kept overnight at the Cobequid Hospital, a facility that is not equipped to handle such cases. The Cobequid has no kitchen and can't properly nourish patients if they are admitted for longer than a few hours. The site stayed open overnight 11 times in the last month. There is a direct correlation between the problems of offload delays and lack of availability with long waits in emergency departments and the need for overflow facilities, and Nova Scotians know that they need their government to be committed in solving these issues. Mr. Speaker, why doesn't the minister have a plan for fixing the backlog of our emergency rooms?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. As I've previously indicated, the work is underway with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the EHS, the partners who provide that emergency care. Obviously, in terms of the process and the flow of multiple partners, EHS transferring from paramedics into the hospital. There are many steps involved, and Mr. Speaker, work has been ongoing for the last number of months to come up with a recommendation, and I anticipate further information in terms of what steps the NSHA will be taking to improve that flow in very short order.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a good segue, Mr. Speaker, into an article that was published last night. The director of the NSHA's emergency program said that she believes that patients, and I quote, and I'll table that article, are better off remaining in beds than on an ambulance stretcher in the hallway, and I couldn't agree with her more. With visits going up and hospitals clogged with people waiting for long-term care, we need additional resources to deal with the bottleneck that's been caused by this government's refusal to invest in health care, with this government's refusal to invest in long-term care. And I think the one solution, Mr. Speaker, is staring us in the face. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister if he will commit today to properly resourcing the Cobequid Health Centre and keep it open 24 hours.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As had been noted previously, both today and in previous sessions of the legislature, looking at the Cobequid centres, we looked at the entire QE2 redevelopment project here in the capital region, looking forward to what and how resources would be deployed. Mr. Speaker, that was part of the questioning. A recommendation did not come in to restructure the status of that particular facility, while it continues to be looked at for services as they continue the details around what services will be offered exactly where. That work is ongoing, and Cobequid is still part of that work within the NSHA and the QE2 redevelopment project team.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are watching with great interest as events unfold in Ottawa surrounding the SNC-Lavalin affair. Ministers are resigning, Prime Minister's staff being called to testify before committees, and speculation is really running wild. And at the root of it all, lobbying. Lobbying is at the root of it all. So my question for the Premier is, given the current state of the lobbyist registry and legislation, if a company was applying pressure to the government of Nova Scotia, how would anyone ever know?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable for a question. Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity to talk to the Honourable Member about the important investments that are taking place in our province. We're very proud of the work that many major companies are looking at. We're very proud of the fact that we've been able to continue to grow our exports because global markets recognize that we have world-class products. Mr. Speaker, we're seeing companies recognize the affordability of living and working in this province over above other major cities in this country. All of that points to a growing population, more young people willing to stay here, continues to make investments, Mr. Speaker. And I want to assure the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, every opportunity we get to work with businesses across this province to continue to create good jobs in this province, we're going to do so, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make sure that we inform not only him but all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear too much about lobbying in there, but what I heard was maybe another game show reference. If the price is right, that's really the issue we're talking about here. There's reports of considerable political pressure put on to interfere in a matter that's really to do with the justice system, and we should never have that type of interference. At a time when the whole nation is watching, Canadians are realizing that they don't like political interference in the justice system. And Canadians are realizing that they need their politicians to be more transparent and more open. This is an opportunity for the Premier to not hide information from Nova Scotians. The Premier of this province used to disclose who they were meeting with and have their daily schedule published. I'd like to ask the Premier, would he commit to once again withholding that tradition and providing regular notice as to who he's meeting with?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member in his preamble talked about the price is right, Mr. Speaker. That's the old days, Mr. Speaker. That's when the Tories were in power, Mr. Speaker. They wrote a check for every issue that was facing the government, followed by successive governments. And, Mr. Speaker, the results showed, Mr. Speaker. Fact of the matter is you're continuing to see the province continue to grow. Mr. Speaker, this province will lead the country in wage growth next year, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to see population growth, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to see young people choose to live here, Mr. Speaker. Those are all positive things, Mr. Speaker. Third consecutive year of record tourism season, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member is attacking the people in the tourism sector to drive it down, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me be open and transparent. Let me be open and transparent as I am every day, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to grow this province, Mr. Speaker, so that hard-working Nova Scotians see a future here, not unlike when they were in power when they saw a future somewhere else.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all I can hear over there is let's make a deal. Huh? Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Students Nova Scotia highlighted the fact that as many as 31% of students that enroll in a maritime university don't end up graduating. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia accounts for a substantial number of these students. The report doesn't get into causes for this high number, but I can guess it's partially because the government hasn't been listening to students for quite some time. So my question to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education is, what does he feel accounts for the significant above-average number of university dropouts in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, since 2013, when our government came into govern in Nova Scotia, the dropout rates in universities have fallen. Mr. Speaker, I will also add that at that time our government brought in tuition forgiveness, which means that a Nova Scotia student attending university can have their tuition forgiven for their Nova Scotia student loan, making their university education much more affordable for them. And as well, Mr. Speaker, we also have been increasing the university budgets. We have brought back all the cuts that the NDP did, which decimated our universities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, we regularly hear from students that this government isn't doing enough to help post-secondary students. We hear that international students can't get sufficient medical coverage. We hear that sexual violence prevention isn't being taken seriously enough. We hear that not nearly enough is being done to address mental health needs in our universities. And the government answers the same way. They answer a lot of inconvenient arguments. They just ignore them, Mr. Speaker. So will the minister commit to including these student priorities in the upcoming MOU between government and universities, or will it continue to allow students just to drift away?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the honourable member had read the last MOU, he would have seen that sexual violence was addressed in it. Mr. Speaker, as well, in terms of mental health supports on campuses, last year's budget...
Please. The Honourable Minister of Labour has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year's budget actually provided $500,000 to funding for mental health supports on universities. And Mr. Speaker, the pilot program was done the year before at Acadia University and showed great promise and great results. Mr. Speaker, as well, at Department of Labour and Advanced Education, I meet with student leaders on a quarterly basis, and we also meet with our university presidents on a quarterly basis. Our department is open to student leadership. Whenever I'm on campus, I seek out the presidents of the university at the university student leadership and have meetings with them. And I hope that the Conservatives support that, because their counterparts in Ontario have been actually attacking student unions, and I hope that they can stand up and actually support student unions like we do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Immigration. Recently, we've heard this government applauding the number of new immigrants who came to Nova Scotia in 2018. And I'll admit the positive momentum is a good thing for this province. But on second glance, once you get past the shine of the headline, you realize that there's something hiding below. And what's hiding below is that 84% of the new immigrants to this province, 84%, settle in Halifax. So my question for the Minister of Immigration is, what is the government doing to encourage immigrants to settle outside of HRM?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. It gives me the opportunity to tell the honourable member, as well as everyone in the House, of the record-setting year that we had in 2018. Not only did we have the greatest number of landings in the province, we had the greatest approved applications. We created 2 new streams, the physician stream and the labour market impact stream. We have recruited more international students that decided to gain permanent residency to the province than ever before. And we've also nominated the first entrepreneurs under our business stream that we've created. These are all record-setting numbers. We're also very excited to work at the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, and I'll explain that to you next question. Go ahead.
The Honourable Minister, the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I think there was a truth there in the end, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is going to give me an answer no matter what I ask, because none of the answers correspond to the questions. I'm asking about why aren't we getting people to the rural areas? In 2018, 4,700 people settled in the Halifax area, but only 70 in Kentville. Less than 100 in each of Truro and New Glasgow, fewer than all of Cape Breton, 200. And the rest of the province combined, just 500 people. This is an imbalance that is not sustainable if our province is to thrive. And the minister can ignore it and come up with some accolades, but it will not lead to success for this province. So a successful rural Nova Scotia is a successful Nova Scotia. I'm going to ask the question again. What is the minister doing to boost immigration to our rural areas of our province?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've been working extremely hard with all the communities across the province. We've entered into partnership with the Cape Breton Partnership, with the Western region, as well as the various friends across the province. We have been having one-on-one discussions with a number of players. We work with all university campuses and attend in person, I as the Minister and my staff, a number of times throughout the year. And let me tell you our success in the Atlantic immigration pilot. We have 40% that are outside the Halifax County that have subscribed to that. That is record numbers, because we know globally that people, newcomers, tend to come to large urban centres. So we are very pleased that the pilot, that 40% of businesses that have been endorsed come from outside the Halifax County.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
My question is for the Premier. Sometime in the period between the Boat Harbour Act and when Northern Pulp brought forward its proposal some 5 weeks ago, it must have begun to become apparent to the government. Certainly it was pointed out by us in the opposition. It must have become apparent that the company was running out of time in order to bring forward a proposal that would allow for both a fulsome environmental assessment and for the honouring of the Boat Harbour deadline. And yet the government, through that time, did nothing to ensure that a proposal was being brought forward. Can the Premier explain or account for the government's failure to ensure that a Northern Pulp proposal was brought forward in time to save the thousands of families and the many, many communities who are under a great cloud of uncertainty today?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the Honourable Member I appreciate the support of all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, with the Boat Harbour Act. Mr. Speaker, some are looking to renege on that. Mr. Speaker, we think it's an important piece of legislation that allows us to continue to deal with the challenges that are associated with Boat Harbour and the fact that Pictou Landing has been dealing with this issue for decades. We are the first government to put a timeline in cleaning it up. We also believe, Mr. Speaker, that that mill can coexist. But I want to remind the Honourable Member it is a private entity. It is up to that company to determine what decisions it makes, whether or not it's going to actually do the treatment center. I can't force them to do it, Mr. Speaker. It's up to them to make that decision. I think, fortunately for all of us, they've made that decision. Now it'll go through an environmental review, Mr. Speaker, to see if it actually can be cited where they are looking to be done, whether or not it would actually pass that environmental assessment.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it seems to me fair to say that there is an element missing in the Premier's response here, and that is the element of the capital R responsibility of the government in such an important matter. Thousands of people in Woods-related work today at work are talking about nothing else other than this issue, because they're living under a cloud of uncertainty, which is the result of the government's having failed to exercise its responsibility to make sure that a proposal was brought forward by Northern Pulp on time. So I would like, in light of this, to ask the Premier to offer an apology to all those thousands of people who are living under that cloud of uncertainty in Woods-related business for the government's mishandling of the whole situation at Northern Pulp.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to look forward to have this go through the process. The Honourable Member has referred to there is now an EA before the government. It will go through its normal process, Mr. Speaker, to determine whether or not that will pass, whether or not that can be cited. Mr. Speaker, if that happens, we'll continue to move forward. If it doesn't, Mr. Speaker, we're looking at how do we best address the challenges as referred to. I think it's important to note, I think I heard the Honourable Member suggest that the mill should close. I don't want to misquote him. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we believe these can coexist, and we're looking forward to seeing what can happen.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Health about the Foyer Père Fils nursing home in Cheticamp. Mr. Speaker, this facility is almost 50 years old. They have some, what I would consider, reasonable requests before government. A bedpan sanitizer, replacement beds, roof repairs, plumbing repairs and air quality improvements. I would expect these to be pretty basic requests to make of government. How does the minister evaluate these kinds of capital requests?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the members asked, the process when facilities or facility operators file a request with their capital needs, particularly emergency-based ones, Mr. Speaker. They do go into the department. Staff review those, Mr. Speaker, based upon the needs of the facilities and other requests that come in, and decisions are made accordingly. Mr. Speaker, that's the process that goes through. There's a budget allocated for that work, and again, there's a significant amount of money that's put forward to our long-term care facilities to help improve their capital situation.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
At the end.
At the very end? Okay, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, residents have experienced being moved out of their rooms to uncomfortable locations due to plumbing issues, enduring last summer's heat wave without proper air conditioning. And when I think of a bedpan sanitizer, I think about how important it is to minimize the spread of C. difficile and the cost of that if that were to spread, and the harm that would do to the residents of the nursing home. So, Mr. Speaker, I think these are reasonable requests. Would it be reasonable to expect that these funding requests will be included in the 2019-20 budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague, the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board announced earlier this session, the budget, the provincial budget will be introduced later this month, and we'll have our budget allocations that go through at that time. I hope the member opposite will support the budget that is tabled, because, Mr. Speaker, it does include funding for the Department of Health and Wellness priorities and investments that we need to make across this province for long-term care services, as well as other healthcare services for Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Highway 289 is a major artery in my constituency that spans 98 kilometres and touches 20 rural communities, from Brookfield to New Glasgow. This is maintained in sections, and the road between Brookfield and Upper Stewiacke has been in disrepair now for a number of years, and vehicles have been damaged, and I can't go anywhere where someone who lives on that road does not mention that road to me. My question is, what is the status for getting work done on Highway 289 between Brookfield and Upper Stewiacke?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. The challenge, of course, in Nova Scotia is that we have significant roads in the 22,000 kilometre range, and they're all requiring attention at one time or another. We have a very good scientific process that brings forward the most pressing requirements that identify to the department the most pressing requirements that we have. The member is bringing forward one that I'll be more than happy to look at, to speak with him, and see where that fits in the overall plan for the department.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Go ahead, Larry. I have more bad news for Highway 289. There's a bridge on Highway 289 that divides the community of Brookfield, and citizens are very concerned about the safety of that bridge. And I have received correspondence from several community groups because they are concerned about the children and the vehicles on that bridge. So is there a time frame in place for getting repairs done to that bridge?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. We have a significant inventory of structures in the province on the basis of, I think, around 4,000. And let me assure the member and the House and all Nova Scotians that we have a very rigorous testing process to ensure that the bridges are suitable for the loads that are being carried. And you will see across the province that when our inspection teams pick up problems, safety problems in these bridges, that we don't waste any time in closing them, even if it's not a planned closure. I have one in my own riding that's been closed now since 3 months. There's one in the Leader of the Opposition's riding that I'm happy to report it's moving forward in terms of the review. And be assured that safety is our biggest consideration, and we will make sure that those bridges are suitable.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. I often hear from constituents about the doctor shortage and concerns that 40% of Dartmouth's family doctors will retire in the next 5 years. Our emergency department at the Dartmouth General is lined up with patients, frequently with only one doctor working. The solution so far has been to ask doctors to work more so as to get through more patients. Healthcare professionals like triage nurses and paramedics are left to navigate a system with too few available beds. My question for the Minister is this: what is his plan to take pressure off ERs so as to allow them to function more efficiently and encourage healthcare workers to stay on the job? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've previously indicated, work is underway with the Nova Scotia Health Authority and EHS service providers to work on our emergency department to make improvements. Mr. Speaker, I think that is in line with improvements we've been seeing over our efforts around supporting recruitment and collaborative care. Mr. Speaker, we're seeing improvements with the attachment of Nova Scotians for the last 3 or 4 months in the province, their attachment with primary care providers. This is what I'd been indicating throughout the fall session, that we had a plan, Mr. Speaker. We made investments. We listened to frontline workers to get those changes implemented. And we've seen, as I've mentioned to the member opposite, 10 new family doctors, 10 doctors in the Dartmouth area since April of last year, Mr. Speaker, and 2 more have accepted offers.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, residents of Dartmouth East, including my own outreach coordinator, have expressed to me that they've witnessed nurses at their wits' end. As was recommended earlier, as was mentioned earlier by the Leader of the Opposition, the Dartmouth General Emergency Room recently had 60 patients waiting to be seen, and staff asked these people if any could go home and come back the next day. Let that sink in for a moment. When ER staff are in tears because they are overworked, burdened, and they're feeling vulnerable, the Minister must acknowledge that there is a crisis in our healthcare system. So my question is this: what will the Minister do to make frontline healthcare professionals feel protected on the job, and how will he encourage healthcare workers to stay on the job amidst so much chaos in the system? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As mentioned previously, and I believe the member likely would have heard from some physicians, Mr. Speaker, as well, that one of the challenges with the volume in our emergency departments relates to people going to emergency departments who require primary care. That's why, for the last period of time, Mr. Speaker, we've had a sustained and focused effort on improving primary care access. We've been investing in collaborative care practices, introduced new recruitment initiatives, Mr. Speaker, including with my colleague, the Minister of Immigration, a new immigration stream, which she talked about earlier. We've seen success through that program. 5 international doctors went to Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker. I had an opportunity to meet with them just last week to talk about their experience and the fact that they're seeing already, after only starting late in the fall, upwards of 1,400 patients in their clinic, each, Mr. Speaker, already. So we see a lot of potential in providing better primary care to all Nova Scotians. That'll help reduce pressure in our emergency departments.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
That was a long one, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect a basic uniform standard of health care in this province. We're certainly not getting it. I was recently contacted by an oral surgery cancer patient who paid $300 for a visit with the oral surgeon in CBRM. Oral surgeons with offices outside a hospital setting do not have their office visits covered by MSI. There is one oral surgeon in Cape Breton, and this oral surgeon has hospital privileges but not a hospital office. This means patients in Cape Breton pay per visit to the oral surgeon, Mr. Speaker. In Halifax, that same visit is covered by MSI. Does the minister agree that it is unfair to have Cape Bretoners pay for services that are otherwise covered by MSI in other areas of this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MSI program is established in accordance with the Canada Health Act, Mr. Speaker, and that's where publicly insured health services really got established, and the rules and parameters around coverage is largely governed by that process, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the member appreciates the fact that we continue to adhere to the Canada Health Act.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents who suffer from an illness are under an extraordinary amount of stress, and many are on a limited or fixed income. Private health insurance is not an option, nor should it have to be, as our provincially funded medical services insurance should not be picking winners and losers. Here we have a situation where an inability to pay often means an inability to receive care. It's shameful and it's inequitable. What steps will the minister take today to ensure that patients in Cape Breton receive the same MSI benefits as patients fortunate enough to live on the mainland?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've already mentioned, the MSI services and policies are applied the same for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, regardless of where they reside. The foundation of the MSI program is grounded in the Canada Health Act, Mr. Speaker, which is the foundation of our universal health care coverage, Mr. Speaker. That's where and how our health services insurance program, as it is in other provinces, has evolved over time, Mr. Speaker. So I assure the member and all Nova Scotians the MSI coverage that is available is equitably applied and for the services as covered by the MSI services.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Yesterday, the Minister's Department met with university presidents about funding and tuition fees, while university students rallied outside despite a snowstorm. They braved the elements, Mr. Speaker, to make it clear once again that tuition fees are just way too high in Nova Scotia. Now, before the minister starts blaming the NDP or starts spouting off a list of current programs, just let me note that the Canadian Federation of Students reports that those programs still leave many students shut out of higher education or else saddled with too much debt. So, I'd like to ask the minister today, after 6 years in power, will 2019 finally be the year that his government starts listening to students and reduces tuition fees?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will reiterate once again that our government has been meeting with student leaders every quarter since we've been elected. And Mr. Speaker, the member points out why university tuition rose, and it rose because of actions of the NDP, which that member and the leader were a member of that government. You cannot expect to cut funding to universities by 10%, because at that point the universities have two other streams to get money, either raise tuition or add on debt. And Mr. Speaker, as been witnessed over the last 2 years in this province, we've supported universities that could not be sustained because the debt load went too high because of cuts made by the NDP.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Gosh, Mr. Speaker, sometimes I have to call this place the fun house because people are just so full of funny remarks. It has been, let me repeat, 6 years. And this minister is still going to blame the NDP? Give me a break. Mr. Speaker, I really have no better response than to quote Aidan McNally, Nova Scotia chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students, about why students rallied in the cold yesterday. She said, and I quote, this government has implemented the most regressive tuition fee policy, which in 2015 effectively deregulated tuition fees for students, which has led to rocketing tuition fees. And the reality is that we're seeing students students today dropping out because of these increases. I will table that, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister admit, as the minister responsible for post-secondary education, at a time when we need to invest in Nova Scotia's youth, this government's policies are actually holding them back?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, once again, as I said earlier, tuition in this province, the formula followed was the NDP formula.
The Honourable Minister of Labour has the floor.
And since the NDP have left government, Mr. Speaker. As well, Mr. Speaker, our most vulnerable students, our most needy students have access to post-secondary, and Mr. Speaker, they have full loan tuition. Mr. Speaker, the other students also have free interest on their student loans. Mr. Speaker, what the NDP's approach is to cut 10% funding. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that our government has restored all that funding and continues to invest in universities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I love that exchange. That was great. Today, my question, as I would in every first question in this House of Assembly, when we open up a new session, I ask a question to the Minister of Transportation. And I've asked this question a number of times to previous ministers, and they revolve around exit 32 on the 103. Back in 2016, the former minister, now the Minister of Business, pretty good guy, not bad guy, said that the intersection mattered, and it was seen as a priority by the district director, and I can let you have that answered as well. As we sit here today, no apparent work has been done at exit 32. So my question to the minister is, if this intersection was a priority over 2 years ago, why hasn't it been improved yet?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question, and I note that he set the bar pretty high in his preamble. But as a matter of fact, we are looking very closely at that significant connector down there. There are actually three intersections that we're hoping to come up with a very comprehensive solution for, and I'd like to assure the member and the people of those communities that that is on our radar, that it is moving forward, and it's in consideration for not too distant future work that will be completed.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know my colleagues are trying to tell me to tell a joke about a Scud missile, but I'm going to stay away from it. Exit 32 is a flat crossing that accesses the community of Argyle Head and the long-term care facility of Nikhil Home. The former minister said the sightlines were a concern for safety. The former minister said that he intended to look at some of the programming to see what the short-term and medium-term fixes could be. And they've been looking. The residents have been looking for a long time for this to get fixed. Would the minister please tell the House the cost of the short and medium-term fixes, and let us know when that work might begin?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we are looking at short-term fixes and also long-term fixes. We see the opportunity there to solve the problem for once and for all. In the meantime, our people are looking at immediately in the spring, looking at enhanced signage in that area to help the situation out as a short-term fix, and in the medium term would be the design for the overall correction for those three intersections that are connected into 32. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of TIR. Last spring I visited Hansport and saw firsthand the destruction caused by the broken Abato. In fact, it looked like it had been hit by a Scud missile. Irreparable damage was caused to properties, and months went by before the government committed to helping. So it was a relief to hear the local MLA announce the government would repair the Abato. My question for the Minister is, when was the decision made for the government to replace the Abato?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to report to the House and to the folks of Hansport that the repair for that particular facility is well underway as we speak here today. Last year, I believe it was August or early September, I had an opportunity to visit the site. I spent quite a bit of time with a local councillor who was a great guide, showed me around there and explained the issues and the problems very clearly. So at that point in time, we decided that we would move forward with a plan to effect those repairs in that abattoir. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Well, that's an interesting answer, Mr. Speaker, because a FOIPOP obtained by our office indicates there was no correspondence about the abattoir between the local MIA and the Minister of TIR before the announcement on January 4th, and I'll table that. It seems pretty irresponsible for a local MLA to make a serious funding announcement to a crowd of concerned citizens without having discussed the matter with the minister responsible. My question is, when was the first time the local MLA brought the matter up with the minister, and when did the minister commit to the funding?
Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the opportunity to explain how effective our internal communication is. We don't have to wait for formal correspondences. We talk to each other, Mr. Speaker.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers as